Hey, how's it going, everybody? Lieutenant Adderbury here, back at it with the Lobo Pack podcast. Today, we have an awesome guest. It's an honor to have Lieutenant Christianson, originally from Minnesota, serving at Fort Polk right now as an infantry officer. Lieutenant Christianson is an alumni from UNM. Hey, Lieutenant Christianson, it's awesome to have you on the podcast. But to start it off, we're really interested in how did you, join the Army? What was your life growing up in Minnesota?
Hey, it's great to be with you. Shout out to the Lobo Battalion. My childhood had some good influences. Had a couple of grandfathers that served. One in the Navy in the Korean War, and then the other one was in the Army between the Korean and Vietnam War. So had some military background in the family. Always had an interest in serving, but had a pretty normal childhood. I spent a lot of time outdoors, hunting and fishing. Feel like some of those things kind of translate to be, that time in the outdoors set me up for success. And then kind of knew what I was getting into going into the Army, where I've rightly assumed that I'd be spending a lot of time outside and, kind of living a rugged lifestyle.
Yeah, definitely. So what was it mainly your grandparents that or grandfather or that had influenced you to just going Army, or were you interested in anything else?
It changed throughout my early childhood years. My first interest, I was always a big history buff, so growing up and watching things on the History Channel, that certainly piqued my curiosity. Initially, I had wanted to go into the Navy. As I got older and realized what the current Navy is constituted by, there were no such thing as battleships and things like that. So that kind of, as I realized some of those things, my interest in the Navy kind of waned. And then I realized that, ground combat and the role that would be best suited for that interest was probably going to be the infantry. And then that branch, that component of the DoD, being the Army's wheelhouse, really.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. And then from there, did you initially join, did you go in and, because you served with the with the Ranger Regiment, did you immediately go into the Ranger Regiment, or did you, how did your career turn out?
Well, I had, it was kind of an interesting start to it. I knew that I wanted to go into ROTC. So I had tried to pursue that through the University of St. Thomas back in Minnesota, and did 2 years there. But my GPA was not high enough to get a scholarship. At that point, I was also in the Army Reserves, and they had to give me a conditional release to go active duty. But by a technicality, I was prior service, so that limited me to 2 MOSs that I could choose from, either a 91 Bravo or an 88 Mike. Being that was about 2011, 2012 when I was facing that down, that was still height of the GWAT. So I figured, if there was something that was going to get me on a deployment outside the wire and something that was going to, put me in harm's way, I guess, that left me with just the 88 Mike choice. From there, while I was at AIT, the recruiters from the Ranger Regiment showed up. Prior to that, I had absolutely no idea what a Ranger was or what the Ranger Regiment was as an institution. And they asked for volunteers, and they started to go down. They had our whole battalion lined up outside, formed up, and they started to kind of whittle us down from the whole battalion, ultimately down to about 50 or 60 of us that were even qualified to join. And then from there, we went into a classroom, watched a cool video of dudes doing some really high speed, cool stuff. They passed around a clipboard, and of those 20 or 30, by time that expressed interest from that point, waited kind of in the dark for a few weeks. And then at the end of my AIT, the battalion commander called 3 of us into his office and told us that we had contracts to go to RASP 1. So as soon as I graduated, that was in November of 2012, went on holiday block leave. And from there went to Fort Benning for airborne school in January and started RASP 1 in February, ultimately finishing up in about April. And then I got to first Ranger Battalion in May of that year.
So okay, a little bit going back, but had you jumped from planes at all before, doing airborne school? And what was that like going to airborne school?
I had never jumped, never skydived, never did anything like that. Honestly, I don't think I had ever even considered it up to that point in my life. I wouldn't say that I had a fear of heights, but the process at airborne school, kind of the crawl, walk, run approach that they take to it, you build up and go through these that ultimately culminate in you jumping out of an aircraft. But in the event of an emergency or something like that, those previous weeks of doing these repetitions, these things over and over, it builds that muscle memory. So that certainly helped instill some confidence in the equipment and the process. The only real memory I have from jumping was when that green light came on the first time and seeing people in front of me. I think I was probably midway through the stick, so probably the 7th or 8th jumper if I had to guess. And as soon as I saw that guy in front of me start moving forward, you really don't have a choice. So I just followed him out the door, did that 5 times, and the rest was history. But prior to that, prior to going to airborne school, I don't think I had ever even considered jumping out of a plane, but it was a really, really exciting experience. And, I thought I was 10 feet tall when I finished up airborne school.
Yeah, no kidding. So I guess another question I had was, so you had gone through AIT and then just airborne school, and you're about to go to RASP 1. How did you feel? Like, was it AIT? Do you feel like prepared you the most, or were you pretty like on top of your game physically, ready for that challenge?
I'd like to think I was physically ready for it. By no means was I, the top physical performer in my class. Referencing something one of the former sergeant majors of the regiment said, and I think it certainly ties in with my experience in RASP 1 and then, throughout my time in Ranger Regiment. But he had said that one of his big takeaways from Ranger Regiment was that it serves you a humble pie every day. There's hardly a room you walk into where there's not somebody that's smarter than you, faster than you, better at any given task. So that competitiveness, I think, breeds excellence. Now to rewind back to my time in RASP 1, I think it was a blend of that kind of competitive nature, and then also, I was fresh out of basic a year prior to that in AIT. So I didn't know much about the Army. If they told me the sky was purple, hey, Sergeant said the sky was purple, so it must be. I was just a sponge at that point in my military career. So I just kind of went through the motions. Again, I wasn't the fastest or the strongest by any means, but I was able to accomplish all the tasks and meet all the thresholds, and I earned my tan beret just one day at a time through the course.
And then how long was it? How long was RASP 1 back then for you guys?
It was still the same construct that it is today. It was just an 8-week course. I think I had spent maybe 2 weeks in pre-RASP. That's where we drew our CIF gear, taking care of some other administrative tasks. But then as soon as we got there, just like the name implies, it was an assessment and selection. There's no train up. You show up and perform, or they cut you loose to the needs of the Army. So again, I kind of went in blind, and whether it was blind luck or, I was really ready for it. I didn't know what I was getting into, but I just took it day by day. And I think the biggest thing is just, I didn't quit, which is what makes up the bulk of the attrition in those classes.
And then so it's 8 weeks. Are you just doing PT all the time during those 8 weeks, or is it like sticks lanes or things like that?
So it had a different structure back when I went through. I don't remember the exact makeup of it, but there was a lot of physical events. You did kind of a progression with ruck marches and things like that. 1 week was a 6, the next week was an 8, 10, and then all the way up to a 12-mile ruck. There was a lot of land navigation. The last couple of weeks of the course involved a lot of shooting, pistol and rifle marksmanship, and then about a week and a half of demolition training.
Really? Okay, that's really interesting that you bring that up. Demolition training. So like they basically train you to like what do you I mean, what are you guys doing out there? Like using like just blowing through doors, like breaching stuff, or yeah, what were you guys doing with it?
Yeah, really basic breaching, trying to think of some of the names. I mean, you building like shape charges to go through reinforced walls, learning different techniques for breaching doors and gates and different barriers that guys were encountering in Iraq and Afghanistan during that time. There were like tamp charges, flex linear, different builds that we did, but there was also mechanical breaching as well. So we had access to quickie saws and other things to breach at a lower decibel than some of those explosive charges.
How did graduating work or look like?
Yeah, we did a lot of those the last couple weeks of the course. They split us into two platoons, and then they just alternated. So we were shooting for about a week and a half, and then we went out to the demolition range, and then the folks that were at the demo range went to shoot, and then that final week was just a mix of some of the out processing requirements that they had, cleaning and turning in our CIF gear, and then graduation rehearsal. So it certainly drew down pretty quickly, but it was probably at that point that it really started to set in that I'd spent a couple of about a month and a half there around some of the guys that I would eventually run into for years and years after that as platoon sergeants, first sergeants, sergeant majors. So the seeing and being around some of those guys really reinforced that these guys were chosen to be cadre for the selection and training company there based on their qualifications, and it really, to answer your question, it reinforced that I'm really getting into a pretty cool unit. The guys that I work with we're cut from a little different cloth.
So what happens from there now that you have graduated? Is there a pipeline of training you have to go to before going to your Ranger Regiment, or how does that work?
Nope. So the purpose of RASP 1 is to create rangers, and then from there they have a base level of knowledge on some of those things, whether that's land navigation, medical training, marksmanship, and demolition that then your gaining battalion can take and mold you further. Me being a truck driver, I went into logistics tasks. So beyond that, after that point on, it didn't, aside from maybe some training here and there, my primary focus wasn't on shooting and demolition and things like that. So there's no difference, or there's no differentiation made in the training pipeline between logistics or low density MOSs and your combat, your 11 Bravos and your shooters. But from there, it was just up to the needs of the Ranger Regiment. If Second Ranger Battalion had a lot of guys PCS over the last couple of months, or ETS, then they would have pulled the bulk of that graduating class and sent them up to that battalion. So I just got lucky and wound up going out to First Ranger Battalion in Savannah.
Was it like getting to your first unit and experiencing that?
It was such a great feeling being free again. This is after months and months of AIT into airborne school into RASP. So having that freedom to go out and get a meal in town, or buy groceries and eat the food that I wanted to. It was really liberating to have that opportunity. Honestly, I don't think I could have asked for a better first duty station either. Anna itself is, with low traffic, maybe 25 minutes from the the beaches out there. Savannah's got a lot of colleges, so the town is just really, really active. You were only an hour and a half from Charleston, another hour and a half from Jacksonville, Florida. So there were tons of opportunities to travel and go to some really, really cool places. But the town itself is awesome. I think the best way to describe it is to compare it to some of the other military towns. You've got bases like Fort Polk, Fort Campbell, Fort Bragg. Those towns were built around the military base, but Savannah was kind of different, especially being at Hunter Army Airfield in the city. The city of Savannah had been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. The base, was built in the town as opposed to the other way around. So you had a lot of great little mom and pop places to eat, and it wasn't I feel like over the years traveling to some of those other bases that I mentioned, you go to the malls or some of the areas around those bases and it's almost identical. You can close your eyes and imagine yourself, or you could be right in Fayetteville, or Leesville or Hinesville, or any place outside of a base, and it was almost the same, places to eat and shop and stuff like that.
Once you got to Ranger Regiment and you're an 88 Mike now, like what was your progression? What was it like being I mean, you said are you a part of a forward support company and you're specifically driving vehicles, or what is and then yeah, exactly. What are you mainly doing there?
So yeah, it's pretty much the equivalent of a forward support company within that rifle battalion. As a brand new private, I as a brand new private, 88 Mike, I was driving vehicles. Hunter Army Airfield and First Ranger Battalion was unique because the base itself did not have the facilities to accommodate our training, so we had to do everything at Fort Stewart, which was about 45 minutes to an hour away. So anything that we needed to do for training required the movement of personnel, equipment, ammunition, any other kind of bear base supplies that are needed to facilitate that training, to quarter troops, provide repair facilities for vehicles. So my job was certainly pretty involved as a private at my first unit there. And then there was, so a training event would happen for the couple of weeks before that. We're prepping and staging our equipment prior to the movement out there. We set up the facilities, or download that equipment, help set it up, and then the expectation was that we jump in and conduct that training as well. Once the buses, or the LMTVs and vehicles would leave with all the personnel and cargo, now here we are moving all that equipment that we moved out there back to base, while simultaneously prepping and setting up for the next week's training exercise or something. So it was, the operational tempo was definitely high, especially on the logistics side, for what I would characterize as a pretty busy unit. As I got to serve longer in Ranger Regiment, kind of learned the training cycle a little bit better, and had a little bit more predictability. But as a private, honestly, I was just doing what my team leader or squad leader told me to do.
Is there anything specifically you guys were gearing up for, such as a deployment when you were first getting there, or maybe a training event like a JRTC deployment or anything like that?
So when I first got there, a First Ranger Battalion was coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq at that point. So I actually showed up I showed up to the rear detachment. Once everybody got back, maybe a month or two later, that began our training cycle. Kind of the Super Bowl event, or the culmination of that training cycle, was our, what we call MLAT, our airfield seizure operation. There was a lot of stuff in between, but the that airfield seizure training would occur, and then we would go on pre-deployment leave, and then we would deploy from September, of 2003 up until, I think, August of 2022. Ranger Regiment had been deployed in CENTCOM, either in Iraq or Afghanistan, that entire time, just cycling through the three battalions. So it was, the first 6 years that I was in Ranger Regiment, First Battalion, I deployed once every year. So it was pretty busy, but that routine deployment cycle really helped drive the training cycle, and vice versa.
One thing I've always heard was that the difference between regular army and Ranger Regiment is that the Ranger Regiment, you go back to when you're starting your training cycle, you're always starting from the bare bones, or the very simplest task. You master the most simplest task, and that just allows you to continue to build and build and build off of that until you master very complex tasks like breaching, like starting with basically how to your dry fires, and then as you know, you do that a bazillion times till you can't get it wrong.
That's 100% accurate. And that's kind of the over the years what I've come to know and has certainly been true. It's a hallmark of the Ranger Regiment, the mastery of the basics so that you can add to kind of the same army adage that you can add to but not take away. So, by mastering those basic soldier tasks, that allows you to add on to that more complex scenarios and a little bit more diverse training. They really, I think, kind of that maybe to call it a crawl, walk, run phase would be an oversimplification, but it certainly was a progression throughout those maybe 7 or 8 months that you were going through that training cycle leading up to the deployment.
And then what other tests did you train on? Like, I think you brought up earlier that you're supposed to be a master of your logistics tasks, but you're also expected to be as good as like the 11 Bravos at shooting and things.
To an extent,
Okay.
one of the biggest things that left an impression on me was some of the first team leaders and squad leaders and guys in my company that I worked with. Some of these dudes, they had all sorts of skill badges and all these other things. And your first impression is, wow, these guys really know what they're doing, and they really demonstrated that. But as much of an ego thing as some of having badges and all these different schools and things are, they really drove home that do the training, take it seriously, so that way it's more than just putting a badge on your uniform. It's allowing you to be a force multiplier and a true asset to the unit. So going to things like air assault school, it produces a badge, but then here I was, a couple of years later in Afghanistan doing sling loads from, some of the main bases to locations where fixed wing aircraft couldn't access. So there really is more than just an ego boosting or something to put on your uniform reason for why we do some of the training that we do. So there was I guess, kind of a parallel focus on your own self development through going to some of those schools to make you a better, in my case, logistician, especially as I moved into some of the higher positions where I was, whereas I started out as a truck driver, I was then moving on to ultimately being a camp commandant, where I'm in charge of facilitating bear base supplies, maintenance, fuel, mechanical repairs, things like that. Not that I was by any means a specialist in any of those areas, but I had enough exposure to it in my time progressing through private to sergeant to staff sergeant and so on, that I could at least effectively manage the individuals that were tasked with accomplishing those niche missions like that.
That is really cool. Is there any, so we are talking about opportunities when you are in so being in Ranger Regiment, what were the first schools you were able to go to that they wanted you like to progress into?
The first and the most important one for us was Ranger School. That's kind of your, RASP one. And I remember this was something they told us when I was a candidate there. They said, RASP is actually the easiest part. Your time there is a continual selection program, because there's a lot of hungry individuals that are trying to get your job or continue to climb up the so maintaining kind of a competitive edge, at different levels. So the first one for me was Ranger School. I got to go. I had a phenomenal first sergeant when I got there, and on my first deployment in the winter of 2013, he sat me down and kind of laid out what he saw for, at the time I felt like it was kind of an individual, not necessarily being singled out, but he sat me down as an individual, but he laid out what he saw for my career progression for the next couple of years. But then in hindsight now, I see that with some of my peers at the time, that was a very similar progression that they had. To answer your question, first and foremost, it was Ranger School. The next one would be going to that promotion board. And then immediately after that, because Ranger Regiment is an airborne unit, to maintain, proficiency for the unit as a whole, but also make yourself an asset to the unit. The next big one was Jump Master School.
Awesome. Okay. And then as far as what was your experience like in Ranger School? Because then you had come back from a deployment. You had already been through RASP. Was going through Ranger School pretty easy for you?
I don't. I wouldn't say. I wouldn't say it was easy. I went in 2014, so I think some of the things I experienced there were similar to, um, hopefully cadets that will go in the next couple of years. The structure of it really hasn't changed much. I think in hindsight, my biggest takeaway was what I learned about myself. But I had kind of started that process going through RASP and my time as a private. So it was really just the biggest one was don't quit. And then you know when things were miserable, when it was raining and we were cold or hot, whatever the circumstances were, I just remember looking around and always knowing that there was somebody a little bit more miserable than I was. Somebody was, their boots were just a little bit soggier than mine were. So that certainly helped me feel better knowing that, well, I'm not in as rough a shape as that guy is. But also whether it was tongue in cheek or they were serious about it, my team leader and squad leader, they pulled me aside before I left and they told me, don't come back without it. So I had that kind of repeating in the back of my head, but also it was just kind of a rite of passage. It was just something that you had to do. So, failure or, hey, I'll try it again next summer when I'm feeling a little bit, I feel like I'm in better shape or a little bit more prepared to go. It was just kind of like, hey, it's your time. Take that opportunity and run with it.
And coming back from Ranger School, now that you had your tab, are you now a sergeant or what? Like, what happens from there? Or is there anything special, now that you had gotten your tab and being in Ranger Regiment?
So at that point, between some of the other training and awards and things like that I had gotten, I maxed out my promotion points. So as soon as they convened a board overseas, I was able to go to that promotion board, and it was pretty easy from there. A lot of time for the 11 Bravo side, they'll tend to laterally promote to corporal. If you're a junior enlisted guy, or you'll automatically make specialist. Maybe you have a tab corporal as a team leader, something already. So there's some nuances to that from the line companies that I don't know what the ins and outs of that were, but for me, I spent just a couple of months as an E4 before going to the promotion board and picking up. I think one of the unique things to Ranger Regiment is that by going to Ranger School, you've demonstrated your potential, certainly, but also your responsibility, your ability to hold a little bit higher responsibility. So that promotion is usually pretty quick after that.
After that experience, are you going back on deployment then and getting ready for that, or what happened then?
So after that promotion board, that was on my second deployment for E5. I got back from that. I went to jump master school. I think that would have been 2016, and then it was, I think, around 26, no, maybe 2017. That's where I picked up staff sergeant, and then just kind of went through continued to go through the training cycle every year into the deployment, and that continued up until 2018.
What was jump master school like for you? And for people who just don't know what it is, could you explain a little bit about what it is?
Yeah, so prior to any airborne operation, there's a significant amount of planning and preparation that goes into it. That's usually facilitated by the unit's jump masters. That's coordinations with the air crew, configuring that or assisting the air force in configuring that aircraft to accommodate your jumpers. So there's kind of that preparation piece for it. The latter part of that preparation is kind of the pre-jump procedures that we go through. We kind of facilitate the going through the motions, if you will, of an airborne operation without being in the aircraft. Again, it kind of ties back to airborne school. So you're getting people kind of that muscle memory of going through the motions, what you're supposed to do, your responsibilities in the air, once you land, where you're assembling. You're reinforcing and kind of hitting on those points again right before jumpers get on that aircraft. And then before jumpers, they'll put on their parachute, but you're the last one that touches that parachute to ensure that it's properly sized to that jumper. It's not going to fall off of them. All the while, you're just doing what you can to instill confidence in those jumpers, because you've got varying levels. You've got anywhere from the battalion sergeant major who's one of the most senior and experienced guys in the unit down to a brand new private that showed up a couple of days ago. So you're just kind of you're that person that they're looking to for the answers, to know what right looks like, and to know what to do. To get to that point though, jump master school, I think you need a minimum of 12 jumps out of a high performance aircraft or a fixed wing aircraft to even go to the school. And I think there's a rank requirement. You have to be like a 5 and above, but it's just a 3-week course. There's the first week is you're in the classroom kind of learning about drop zones, the capabilities and the abilities of certain Air Force aircraft, translating some of the nuances of both. The Army measures things in meters, but the Air Force measures in yards. So kind of bridging that knowledge gap. And then the second week is JMPI, Jump Master Pre-Inspection. So that's where you're just you're running your hands raw over parachute harnesses on your classmates. The progression through that is a really interesting one as well, and it's kind of mirrored in other Army schools as well. So you would rig up in buddy pairs, and then everybody would have I guess what you could call like a clean parachute on. There's no deficiencies. It's rigged up properly, and you get so many reps going over it. So you build that muscle memory and learn what right looks like, and then later in the week, they put in deficiencies, whether that's a strap twisted or a buckle not buckled. And then you have to identify the proper nomenclature of that piece of equipment, and also, identify that either for the parachute rigger to address, or you identify it properly so that you can correct it so that jumper is going to safely exit an aircraft and land on the ground. And then finally, that third week is just testing out. Uh, you also conduct the jump master procedures up in the aircraft. So you get kind of you do it live, for lack of a better term. And you don't exit jumpers, the jump master instructors do, but you get to go through the motions up in that aircraft, and that was a pretty cool experience doing that, and just kind of learning, getting that dedicated time to go through and inspect, and really to also to get some face time and talk to those air crews and those load masters on that plane. So you learn the capabilities and the limitations that they have. So it was really an awesome experience, and it gave me a ton of confidence in not only the equipment but the process as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. So now that you had graduated from jump master school, where did you go from there? Are you doing duties now? Are you basically just continue to climb the ladder in the logistics, like the FSC that you're a part of?
Yeah, so this continues on up until 2018. My first sergeant had pulled me aside, and this was after, whether it was in Afghanistan or stateside, kind of some FaceTime that I had with my battalion CSM at that point, who eventually later in 2018 went on to become the regimental sergeant major. And around that time, there was a lot going on geopolitically. That was one of the last times that North Korea was kind of that seemed like a potential that there was going to be conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So there was a lot going on. So Ranger Regiment, there were some, especially on the logistics side, they were hurting on numbers a little bit. So that led to some of that FaceTime with my CSM, kind of asking some questions like, hey, what could we do to either keep guys here, or what could we do on the kind of the initial entry training side, whether that's going to do PT at basic training, changing out the kind of the recruiters or the LNOs that we had at some of the AIT sites. I had a number of ideas then. I remember talking to him about that. Well, didn't hear much back about that. But then later that year, my first sergeant approached me and said, hey, Sergeant Major wants to pull you over to the Regimental Selection and Training Company to go do RASP 1 times. I PCS'd out there in November of 2018. I started my year and a half as a RASP 1 instructor.
Wow, that's an awesome experience. So, and then what was that experience like as far as because now do you have to go through a drill sort of instructor school?
So there was really no formal There was no formal train up for that job. The RASP-1 is the regimental commander's program, so all that is done in house. There was some stuff way above my head that I didn't. They fell under the JFK Special Warfare. I don't remember the big acronym, but for accreditation, they ran some of that through that kind of that another USASOC schoolhouse. But it was a really great experience, and I had remembered back. My only frame of reference was from when I went through RASP. What would have been 5 years prior to that, 5.5 years. When I went through, there was at that time he was just an E5, but there was this NCO that was one of the instructors there, and they'd continued that, I think, throughout the years. And then I ended up getting that unique opportunity in 2018. So I think they had always tried to have a low density or like a logistics MOS represented there. Because Ranger Regiment is the bulk of it, of the MOSs that go through RASP-1. The largest population by far is 11 Bravo. The next largest is 68 Whiskey or Combat Medic. And then from there, it's just onesies and twosies from all the different support MOSs that Ranger Regiment employs. But it was a really great opportunity because you have a very qualified, very knowledgeable, staff sergeant that's been in 11 Bravo his whole career, talking to perhaps a parachute rigger or a mechanic or a fueler or something like that about what their experience is going to be like in Ranger Regiment. That's kind of where I filled that void. I could talk to some of those guys and give them a heads up of, this is what day-to-day life is going to look like for you. These are what some of your training opportunities are going to involve. Everybody goes through the same selection process, but from that point on, the job experience and the experience that every individual has varies greatly.
Yeah, no kidding. Some of my buddies who are 11 alphas who are interested or trying to go into that field right now, some of them decided, or to like RASP 2, but some of them decided that, hey, or from what I've heard is like, if you switched over to a different MOS, they don't have that, like S1, S4, some sort of a different, what do you call it, MOS. It's sort of easier to get selected into something just because everybody has this image in their head of a Ranger Regiment's just 11 Bs running around shooting and stuff like that. It's not that, it's a regiment. Like, you need everybody. Like, it's not just 11 Alpha or 11 series. Which no, that's really awesome. You got that opportunity, and then you were able to mentor people into that too. Just because it's like, yeah, do you have any notable experiences from that?
It was because, and I kind of laid out the structure of the course. The last couple of weeks were shooting and demolition. So because that wasn't my forte, I was a RASP-1 Phase 1 instructor. So my job was to help facilitate and train up on the land navigation, staff, and kind of monitor the other physical events leading up to that. The kind of the culmination of those first 4 weeks, which was Coal Range. That's just, it's 4 days of being out in the woods, and it's really a gut check. A lot of really physically demanding, really strains. That's the process was to filter out those that either physically or just weren't in the right headspace, whether that was maturity or they just, they were kind of on the fence whether they wanted to stick out the course or not. No, nothing crazy really sticks out in my mind. I mean, there were definitely some interesting individuals that went through the course, and a lot of them are still there. I think the cool experience that I had was more so after I had finished my time at RASP-1. To answer your question, I would run into guys over the years I remembered from the course. Regiment is still pretty small. I think it's ballpark maybe like 3,000 Rangers or so. So pretty small community. And over that time, I think I had interacted with maybe a third or greater of that number through my time as an instructor. But it was really the cool experiences afterwards where I'd run into them in the chow hall or something, and they'd, hey, Sergeant, I just graduated Ranger school, and it's like, wow, man, I'm so proud of you. Some of these dudes would really just they'd hit their stride and start crushing their first couple of years of their career. Again, kind of hitting some of those benchmarks
Yeah, no, that's amazing.
that Ranger school, and then maybe putting on or something like that. So it was really rewarding to see the progression that some of those guys would make, but also knowing and it was really something that weighed on me, but in a good way, that I'm helping identify and select future members, but also leaders in this organization. And then as those guys filter out, they're going to go be leaders across the entire army. So it was really that was a really awesome experience, but also responsibility that I took seriously while I was there.
So, now that you had completed or were there for that, did you do any specialized schooling, such as what do you call it, Pathfinder or anything like that?
Yeah, so after I finished up my time there in the Special Troops Battalion, which has the Regimental Selection and Training Company, Communications Company, and the Reconnaissance Company. They have a platoon within their HHC that kind of acts as their FSC equivalent, just on a much smaller scale. So that platoon sergeant spot became vacant, and I got picked to go in to fill that role. While I was there, I went to SLC, promoted to Sergeant First Class, and had the opportunity, I think this was 2021, to go to Pathfinder school. And that kind of coincided with the time that, in the back of my mind, I knew that I wanted to do green to gold. And during my time, I actually finished it up successfully while I was a RASP 1 instructor, but I was able to finish my bachelor's online. And that was kind of playing the long game, because I knew, again, I wanted to do green to gold, and that allowed me to not only apply to green to gold, but to apply there for my master's program instead of just finishing up my bachelor's.
Okay. Yeah, no kidding. And then what did it look like? So had you in the back of your mind, basically, because you had gone through this huge career, was green to gold always in the back of your mind? Like, eventually I'm gonna get to that, basically, like go become an officer,
Yeah,
like
it
ever
was. It
since
was.
you graduated.
It was kind of it was something that I'd always wanted to do. Again, right out of high school, I tried to do ROTC through University of Minnesota, so it was kind of an unconquered challenge, but also just a way to be a leader in the army, just in a different capacity. But also, it was I also saw it as taking advantage of some of the programs and stuff that the army has. I paid out of pocket because I wasn't on scholarship for the first 2 years of my undergrad. But the last 2 years of that, I was able to take advantage of the tuition assistance while I was active duty. And then green to gold, the nuances of that program, I ended up having to tap into my GI Bill to pay for grad school. But I was able to commission as an officer through that approach. Around the time that I was doing my platoon sergeant time, I was at one of the gyms that I went to over near Fort Benning. There was a guy that was a professor at Auburn University, and he had gone through OCS back in the '90s, and he was a big influence and a big help, get me in touch with the ROTC folks out at Auburn. So I got to kind of know the process and knew what it took. But he was trying to push me in that OCS direction, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity for the Army to help facilitate me getting my graduate degree. That was it toyed with the idea of both of them, but in the end, the green to gold route was best for me at that point in my life.
How did you find out about the University of New Mexico then? Now that you've been interested in green to gold, but when did you find out about UNM?
So as I had gone through the process a little bit further, because the specifically with green to gold, and I'm not sure with some of the other applicants for like undergrad, but the green to gold process starts almost a year before you would even look to start school, and it's broken into two phases. The first phase is really easy. There's some minimum things. If your GT score is above this or below this, I'm sorry, or you have some of these other issues like UCMJ action or something like that, you proceed no further. But if you clear that first that first threshold and get into the phase two, that's where you're doing like the medical evaluations, getting the letters of recommendation from your commander, and going through a little bit more of the process. So again, this was probably taking place in spring to summer of 2021. And then I ultimately started school in 2022 there in that fall semester. Around the time that I was a RASP cadre, another Lobo alumni had passed through IBOLIC, and got to talking to him about the school, because I was really up in the air where I wanted to go. I knew what I wanted to do, just not where I wanted to accomplish it at. And talking with him, and then another mutual friend that ultimately made his way into 3rd Ranger Battalion, who's from the Albuquerque area, really was sold on the Southwest. I knew that's where I wanted to go, but applied at some schools, and applied at some different schools in the area. Applied at UTEP, school up in Wyoming, and some other places, and either didn't hear back from them or was denied. But, as I pursued University of New Mexico a little bit further and got tied in with some of the awesome staff there, I'd be remiss if I didn't give a shout out to Mr. Savini. Ultimately, who I would credit with my success in getting in, and then also through the program. But there were a lot of others. There were guys like Mr. Dimmer and stuff too that helped get me enrolled, and then cross some of the hurdles that I was running into with the application process.
What ultimately the amazing staff, really facilitated you coming here? But was it the weather? Was it the terrain? Like, what really sold you about New Mexico, and why not, someplace like Auburn?
Well, I guess it was ultimately I wasn't. I had a lot of freedom to choose, because wherever I went to school, they were guaranteed their tuition. So I kind of narrowed it down a couple of different ways. I knew I didn't want to go home back to the Midwest. I didn't want to stay in the Southeast. Didn't want to go to New England. But then my grandparents lived in Phoenix, and I always enjoyed the climate and the weather. Heat, you're going to deal with heat almost anywhere. Dry heat, that's a little bit more manageable. As I started to learn a little bit more about Albuquerque and New Mexico, it really left an impression on me, and that really helped narrow it down. And I will say, like, prior to going to school out there, had you put a map in front of me, I don't know if I could have even pointed to New Mexico on the map. But having the privilege of going to school there, and living there for a couple of years, it was one of the greatest experiences of my life.
And then what can you tell me about the program when you went through it? So you started in the fall of 2022?
Yeah, that's correct. So I don't know if it was I think it was probably because I was prior service and then also doing, grad school, but I jumped in as an MS3. The classmates I had there were all awesome. There was only, I think, maybe 15 to 20 of us. The numbers kind of ebbed and flowed over the years, but you know, had some phenomenal instructors. Guys like Captain Rounds and Sergeant First Class Dewar were awesome in helping me get integrated, because I was coming into this program where all my peers there and classmates had already served. They were going on their 3rd year in the program together, and then going from being in the Army, having been a Sergeant First Class, and now I'm a cadet like everybody else. That wasn't really that big of a deal for me, but it gave me an opportunity to maybe help think outside the box, or it was a great opportunity. And again, some of those instructors helped me leverage that to really, try and benefit everybody. I was trying to use my experience to help other individuals, but not being overbearing or telling them what to do. It was a good opportunity to be, really collaborative with everybody there.
And then as an MS3, did you do any of the special teams that we had at UNM?
Initially, I was interested in doing there was like color guard and some other ones. I tried to steer towards more of the physical ones. Ranger Challenge, I could not with what I had on, coming from my background, I could not pass up the opportunity to be on the Ranger Challenge team. But there was the Duke City Marathon that I participated in. The Baton Death March was another phenomenal opportunity and experience. But I think the coolest one by far was the Ranger Challenge team.
And then, yeah, from what I remember, at least from what I see, like you guys won the what do you call it? The Task Force Ranger Challenge, right? And then you guys went to Brigade,
Yeah, in our MS4 year,
and
we certainly
yeah,
learned a lot, and it reinforced that having some of those MS1s and MS2s in that Ranger Challenge program to kind of take some of those lessons learned into the next, the next year's Ranger Challenge, train up, and then also the competition itself was absolutely crucial. We had great there were, when I was in MS3, there were some phenomenal MS4s that were on the team, but there were some big shoes to fill for sure. But yeah, we had a phenomenal team my MS4 year, and we did win at the task force level and then went up to the brigade level. Unfortunately, we didn't go further than that, but hopefully, uh, I've been away for a little while, so hopefully some of that kind of core cadre of MS2s and threes from 2 years ago had helped the team, continue to be competitive for the last 2 years.
what specifically did you decide that you wanted to do? Because you were an 88 Mike. What did you decide you wanted to commission into, and as what?
Well, having been in the army at that point, 10 to 11 years, it was kind of, and not only my experience with, I just to answer your question, I had immediately disregarded things like MP, aviation. So there was a number of branches that I knew from the outset that I didn't want to get into because of my exposure to the the shooters and the door kickers in Ranger Regiment. That certainly left an impression on me. And it was always close, but it was never mine. So that was certainly a driving factor in choosing to become an 11 Alpha. But also just all those years as a logistics, as a logistics NCO and logistician in Ranger Regiment in that high op tempo. I can't tell you the number of times I had to pick up the phone at 2 or 3 in the morning to move heaven and earth to accomplish some task. And I thought, well, maybe I could be in a position where I'm the one placing the phone call and then going right back to bed. So those two things really influenced my decision.
Now that you've graduated, what was it like going to your duty station? Did you pick when you were still in at UNM where you wanted to go, or did you have to go to Bullock first?
So I had to go to Bullock first. I remember, I think it was in the spring before I graduated, or maybe the winter or spring before I graduated and commissioned. We had a preference sheet for our ultimate duty station. By that point, I guess it would have been the winter or spring, because we had already found out our branches, but then our preference sheet, we got to fill that out. Um, Fort Polk and 10th Mountain was nowhere near the top of my list, but at the end of the day, we're round pegs for round holes. So you know how much they take that into consideration, I don't really know. I had to go to so after that, prior to going to Ibolic, we had already gotten our within our orders. It had our follow-on duty assignment. We were the first. We were the first, either in recent memory or ever, to have been assigned our duty station before we had finished Bolic. My understanding, talking to some of my peers and guys that had graduated a couple years before me, is that part of the process for iBolic, and one of the things that drove competition there, was competing for duty stations. Since that changed, I'm not sure what the result has been, but I knew before going to iBolic where I was going to wind up.
What do you see for your like? Do you have goals you want to sort of? Do you want to go back to Ranger Regiment? Things like that.
Yeah, that's the plan. I'm currently on staff right now. I'm doing my time in the S3 shop, common landing ground for freshly commissioned lieutenants out of Bolic. So, just going through that process. But I'm not sure off the top of my head when the window opens, but I know I have to have one OER, including my time as a platoon leader, before I can submit that RASP-2 packet. At that point, I would wait for a class state and a response from them, and then that would start the process for getting my foot back in the door for, going back to Ranger Regiment. the other unique thing about Ranger Regiment is that in every position, you're doing it for the second time, if you will. So as a PL, you've already been a platoon leader in the conventional army, and then you'd go back and be a platoon leader in Ranger Regiment. Same with like company commander all the way up to the regimental commander. So you're doing those positions for the second time. So they have a baseline to uh, assess and kind of rack and stack you amongst your peers for hiring for some of those openings as they pop up.
Since you're gonna be a platoon leader, so are they gonna look at your platoon leader time OER and be like, okay, then he can serve as a platoon leader before going to RASP 2 or something like that? Or,
It's something that
depending on how well you do, basically, as a
yeah, correct.
platoon leader OER? Okay.
Because there's so many out of Alpha Bravo Charlie, so I guess there's and then your specialty platoons, but I think those are
Hmm.
post line PL time. But the thinking of it like a pyramid, you've got the bulk of your RASP 2 classes would be your prospective platoon leaders. So I would be competing against other guys across the army for a handful of platoon PL slots that open up to get in there. So yeah, they'll look at they'll consider your prior evaluation, but also your performance in the course itself.
That's awesome. You were a platoon sergeant. Do you have any recommendations or like working with a platoon leader or as an officer coming into a platoon?
I think just be willing to learn. Certainly try and buy into the organization. I think as you get into a platoon leader position, all your junior enlisted guys, your privates and stuff like that, they're going to look to guys like you or, individuals like the platoon leader as an example. It could be something as simple as buying the platoon or the company T-shirt and wearing it at PT. If they don't see their leadership buying into the organization, then they're going to be a little bit more reluctant to do that. The other thing I think I mentioned it before was just be willing to learn, the organization that you're going into, whether that's, the Aiken Airborne or the 101st or wherever across the force you're going, that organization has been there for a long time. That's not to say that they always do everything right, but really just be kind of keep an open mind. Hey, maybe they're doing something and you can make improvements in certain areas, whether that's like an administrative thing or a platoon culture. So impact those things where you can, and ultimately kind of choose your battles. If you're ever going to have a disagreement with your platoon sergeant or something like that, never do it, with an open door. Keep those. You want to present a unified, especially when you're addressing the, your subordinates. So those are a couple of things off the top of my head that I can think. Certainly, do things to change the culture if need be, to make everybody feel like they're a member of the team. And that starts with something as simple as getting the platoon shirt or putting the platoon sticker on your Nalgene bottle.
Yeah, totally. On top of that, anybody interested in the Ranger Regiment specifically, do you have any advice for, our lieutenants or any lieutenants in general, or anybody interested in going into the Ranger Regiment?
So the the Ranger Regiment has a recruiting cell. They've got some information on their website about when the windows open up based on your year group and kind of what they're looking for prospective hires. But just keep yourself physically and mentally sharp. Those are really the two biggest pieces of advice I can give to anybody considering it. But make yourself a marketable, but then also an asset to your unit. Some units are a little bit different. There's when senior leaders from Ranger Regiment go and do their charter time, so between company command time before you go to do staff or something like that, you'll probably have to go back out to the regular army for a period of time. Some of those guys, because Ranger Regiment's an airborne unit, they're going to filter back to places like the 82nd or 11th Airborne or the 173rd. But don't be discouraged if individuals in your chain of command, if you find yourself at a place like Fort Hood or Fort Stewart or someplace like that, a non-airborne unit, they may not be as they may not be as open to sending, potentially a really effective leader within their organization. But at the end of the day, definitely have an obligation to your unit, but you got to really do what's best for you and your future. So I think the biggest pieces of advice I could give is just keep yourself physically and mentally sharp, and then do what's best for you.
Awesome. Well, Lieutenant Christensen, you got anything else? Other than that, we'll call it. But it's been awesome having you on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for your time and the opportunity.